Okay, I think we can get started. I presume that we'll have one or two more people showing up. So today we're finishing causal explanation and causal mechanisms. We have two presentations. Ethan, you're doing a presentation. Who else is doing a presentation? You're presenting on Abbott, are you?
No.
Or on yeah, the new pragmatism.
Gross.
Gross, okay, and you're presenting on Abbott. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, those will be interesting presentations. I look at the topic of causal mechanisms as being a very important topic within the context of the theory of social explanation, causal explanation, social explanation. And I look at it in a fairly commonsensical way. Was it Hume who solved the problem of induction? Or maybe, I forget who it was. Maybe some of you philosophy types will. I'm a philosophy type too. I just don't remember who did this. We solved the problem of induction by kicking a stone and saying I can determine the properties of the stone by kicking it or something like that. Ethan, do you remember the story? Maybe it wasn't Hume because Hume was more of a skeptic. Anyway, kind of ordinary thinking about explanation. Why did an event occur? And how was it possible for the event to occur? Causal mechanisms give us a way of answering both those kinds of questions. Why did the event occur? And what is it we want to know when we ask for an explanation of something? Something I've been kind of grappling with for quite a while now is why does U of M, which has such, I think, a culture of, I don't know, ethical behavior, why do we have a persistent recurrence of problems of sexual and gender harassment? That's a why question. And to have an explanation is to identify some of the features of life and workings of the university in virtue of which sexual and gender harassment or many other kind of social ills can occur. So social mechanisms explanation is basically a mechanism, an explanation which is designed to answer the question, why does such and so kind of event occur? And it tries to give a very specific kind of answer to that question. The answer is to identify a kind of unified set of linked processes which lead from a triggering event to an outcome event. A triggering event to an outcome event. That would be kind of the heart of the idea of a mechanism. So if I'm lighting a old-fashioned kind of match, the triggering event is the friction along the emery board or whatever, and then the chemical reaction which occurs, and then the flaring of the match. That whole sequence is the lighting of the match mechanism. And it is a chemical sequence. It goes from that first frictional event to the exposure to oxygen, to the rapid oxidation, to the open flame. Are there similarly direct and clear examples of social mechanisms where there's a triggering event and then an outcome? Well, could we think of some of the ways? Yeah, think about Rodney King and the Los Angeles racial disturbances that were created by the Rodney King incident. Do you remember the Rodney King? So Rodney King was a black driver who was beaten by white policemen, and then it led to one of the largest racial disturbances. I'm avoiding the word riot for a variety of reasons, but what I'm actually asking you to think about is how could we analyze the occurrence of the Detroit uprising in 1967 or the Rodney King Los Angeles racial disturbance in whenever that was, in the 90s, was it? It'd be great if we had
93, I think.
can we think of a way of analyzing that incident in a way which invokes mechanism as at least part of the explanation. And I think we can. It's not that there's one mechanism which led to a conflagration that led to millions of dollars in property damage, lots and lots of arson, lots of injuries. I don't recall whether there were deaths in the course of those several days of civil unrest. But the triggering mechanism was a fairly simple triggering mechanism. It was a provocation created by a televised video beating of from what you could infer from the video, an innocent Black driver by a group of bullying policemen, which then led to anger on the part of lots of people. And then the kind of mechanism that we read about in Tilly, the spreading of arousal and willingness to be involved in collective action. That would be a causal mechanisms or a social mechanisms explanation of one part of that Rodney King civil unrest. What's interesting about any particular instance is that there are multiple mechanisms in play. There are multiple processes in play. So that if we were, take the 1967 Detroit uprising. And I think I mentioned the blind pig, the raid on the blind pig. I think we talked about a couple of sessions ago, but that was very similar to the Rodney King arrest. But then there were other mechanisms, other causal factors, which led to what could conceivably have been a flare-up of very localized violence and anger, and then subsiding to a citywide or even region-wide conflict with a lot of arson, a significant amount of loss of life, almost entirely Black life. Very few white people were, in fact, there may not have been any white people who were killed in that process. I'm not an expert, but that's my recollection is it was very heavily weighted towards Black casualties. But the point would be that if you were a Tilly doing a history of the Detroit uprising, you would identify not one triggering mechanism, but you would identify a number of interlocking occurrences or mechanisms which then unfolded and led to a broadening conflagration. There's one piece of that story which I remember as being fairly interesting. There was a call from the governor that federal troops should be released in Detroit to restore order. 67 would be Johnson, LBJ, was president at that time. It sounds about right. And Johnson considered that request and decided that troops would be authorized, but they would not be issued weapons. They would not be there, or maybe they would have weapons, but they wouldn't be loaded. They wouldn't be ready for killing people. That's an interesting small decision, which if it had gone the other way, could have had very dramatic further consequences. So what was a mostly unarmed civil conflict could have become an armed and very, very costly, even more costly conflict as a result. So what I'm kind of getting at is that social events and happenings, we can account for the occurrence of what seem like very singular, unique occurrences by identifying a handful of mechanisms which led to the outcome. That's the underlying idea of why causal mechanism theory has been very appealing to a wide range of philosophers of the social sciences, and also philosophers of biology and psychology and other areas of science. So let's take a step back and recall what the alternative is. The primary theory of explanation in the 1950s and 60s was, number one, derived from the natural sciences. Number two, it was post-Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle was a positivist empiricist group of philosophers. Can you guess where? Not in Zurich, not in Berlin, but in Vienna, the Vienna Circle, who were very concerned to give a very sparse account of scientific methodology and the epistemology of science. And the post-positivists, the kind of the critique of the view of science, which was put forward by people like Rudolf Carnap and Hans Reichenbach, but also Karl Hempel. Karl Hempel was within the circle of the Vienna Circle as kind of a not a follower exactly, but a part of the conversation. But he also became part of the next generation of philosophy of science, and he offered the hypothetico-deductive model of explanation, or what is often referred to as the covering law model of explanation. And so it was Hempel's idea that we explain outcomes in the natural sciences by discovering general laws and singular conditions, which allow us to infer the outcome. So if you were interested in why do Tesla vehicles sometimes blow up spontaneously, you would want to know the chemistry of, I think we talked about this last time, you informed me what kind of batteries these are. Lithium what?
Ion?
Lithium ion batteries, okay. So we need to have a chemist who can tell us the laws of chemistry of lithium ion batteries. And we need to know the particular boundary conditions which can give rise to an uncontrolled release of energy leading to a lot of heat. So we need the chemistry, that's the natural laws of chemistry pertaining to lithium ion batteries. We need the boundary conditions, and then we can infer the explosion or the fire or whatever. That's referred to as the covering law model of explanation. And for the period from about 1955 to about 1970, it was the preferred model of scientific explanation. We explain an outcome by deducing it from one or more general laws and boundary conditions or specific factual circumstances. There was a kind of a desire, an impulse to say, well, this was actually another piece of positivist philosophy of science. It was the idea of the unity of science, that if this is a good model of explanation for biology and physics, then all the sciences should use the same model of explanation, and therefore the covering law model should also be used, or should be kind of our assumption in the social sciences. And so there was the idea that explanation in the social sciences should also find some general laws and then derive outcomes. And that's not a completely silly perspective for some areas of science, some areas of social science. So we might say, for example, that there are regularities of a market economy, which is probably what the Fed is relying on to try to introduce policies which control inflation. Regularities which say if you do X, Y, and Z, then you will bring about price increases. And if you refrain from doing X, Y, and Z, then prices will be stable. Those are both kind of general laws. I would not want to dispute that there are regularities that we can refer to in some areas of the social sciences. But what I think most social philosophers of social science kind of came to is the realization that the social world is way more heterogeneous and diverse than the economist's model of economic behavior. So that there are multiple causes, multiple factors, multiple tempos, which turns out actually to be a very interesting feature of social change, is the fact that some causal processes have a, let's say a day-to-day causal cycle, and others have a year-to-year causal cycle. And so there can be kind of a periodic coming together of occurrences. I mean, I don't know, if inflation is caused by a very tough winter and people driving their cars too much, and people drive their cars too much in a seasonal way, and very tough winters happen every 10 years, then it may be every 20 or 30 years that you get a coincidence of people driving their cars too much and a very tough winter. I just made all of that up. There's no regularity to that correspondence. So I'm just trying to sort of get the synchronization or lack of synchronization of the working of different causal factors. So in other words, covering law explanations are not completely impossible in the social world, but I would put it to you that most of the interesting cases where we don't understand a social phenomenon, we don't understand why such and so occurs, mostly we don't have a background generalization or law or social law, like when prices go up, consumption goes down. We don't, in most areas of sociology, political science, we don't have general laws like that. So the covering law model is not a particularly appealing model in the social sciences. It turns out the covering law model has its problems also in the natural sciences. And, but I'm not going to talk about those problems. What was appealing about causal mechanisms theory, if you thought the only thing we can say about causation is that causation means something analogous to strong regularities, strong laws of nature, strong associations between one kind of event and another kind of event. That's kind of the Humean conception of causation. Hume had the view that the only thing we can say about causation is that it is constant conjunction. Whenever I flick the match against the matchbox, the flame comes. And that allows me to say flicking the match causes the flame to come. But according to Hume, there's nothing more to it than that. It's just a constant conjunction. It's just a regularity. If we thought that was all there was to it in either the social world or, for that matter, the natural world, then there are a lot of questions and issues and puzzlements about causation that we would not be able to answer. For example, why is there this association between the flicking of the match? Isn't there some underlying explanation? Well, to offer a mechanism is to offer an underlying explanation for why the association occurs between the one event and the second event. So the move to causal mechanisms in the 1990s in the social sciences was the recognition that the covering law model doesn't work very well at all in the social sciences or the historical sciences. If you're interested in revolution, there just don't seem to be any strong regularities at all about revolutions, when they occur, why they occur, when they fail, when they succeed. There's a lot of contingency. And so we don't seem to have regularities, and therefore, if regularities were the long and the short of it for causation, then we'd sort of be forced to say revolutions don't have causes. The causal mechanisms view is a disaggregation. It's asking not what are the general causal regularities, but rather what are the more particular granular causal processes or real causal interactions which occur, which bring about the outcomes that are of interest to us. So in other words, I guess what I'm really wanting to share with you is the idea that there's something intuitively very powerful about the idea of moving to an analysis of causal mechanisms. It lines up very well with our scientific interests, whether they're in biology or in psychology or in the social sciences. Why does a certain kind of outcome occur? Why do people have panic attacks? Well, it may be that there isn't a single answer to the question. I'm talking psychology now. There isn't a single answer to why people have panic attacks, but there are 2 or 3 primary mechanisms or psychological pathways through which individuals have panic attacks. And we have, instead of a weak association at the macro level, we have a very strong statement we can make at the granular level, the causal mechanisms level. We can say that when these circumstances occur for a person with this kind of neurophysiology, then we get a high likelihood of a panic attack, let's say. That would be the psychological application. And we might also find there are very few instances of pure cases where, that particular antecedent condition is present and no other interfering condition is present. That particular psychological mechanism is in place and the outcome is in place. In other words, panic attacks may be always kind of mixed. But what that requires simply is that we then have an analysis of the multiple causal mechanisms which go into the production of a panic attack. Likewise, with, let's say, racial conflict, we might say one of the really valuable and productive results of the kind of analysis that a Charles Tilley of racial conflict is able to provide for us is kind of a taxonomy of the various pathways through which the ordinary antagonisms of a racialized society lead occasionally, not usually, but occasionally, lead to outbursts of overt conflict, and then mechanisms of escalation exist as well. So in other words, we can explain. I have a white noise example in mind, a white noise metaphor in mind. But if there's a hum in this room, there happens to be a hum in this room. You can hear it's a ventilation system, I think. But if it were just literally white noise, just sounds kind of random. And if, as we analyze it, we just see an oscilloscope, with bouncy wave patterns. If we could disaggregate that into the sounds created by the creaking of the furniture and the mice in the walls and the vibrations of the building underneath. I was visiting Seattle about 8 or 10 years ago, and people in a scientific lab were saying to me, we're in serious trouble here because we measure really fine stuff and they're building a subway underneath us. And so the vibrations from the subway construction are interfering with all of our observations. Well, what looks like just white noise may be the sum of a number of independent and comprehensible causal processes. And we might say, I don't know if you see the analogy that I'm getting at here or not, we might say that if we just had this really cool encyclopedia of revolutions, and we had read about every revolution we could think of, the Russian, the Iranian, the Nicaraguan, the Beatles, they were a revolution too, revolutions of every kind. And we might say, it's incomprehensible why they occur. There's no pattern here at all. There are no generating regularities here. But then if we disaggregate and if we become a Chuck Tilley with repertoires, he has this great idea of repertoires of contention. That was an early idea of Chuck Tilley's. And it kind of evolves into repertoires of causal processes or causal mechanisms occurring in contention. And we can then look at our encyclopedia of revolutions, and we can see that each of these revolutions is different from the others, but each of them is comprehensible because we can identify, or at least partially comprehensible, we can identify some of the concrete social processes in 1917 in Moscow, in 1938 in Shanghai, or 34 in Shanghai, in I don't know when the Sandinistas were, I guess they were probably 76, 74, 76. In different periods of time, we can identify mechanisms, probably different mechanisms in each of those cases. The mechanisms leading to the Chinese Revolution were very different from the mechanisms leading to the Russian Revolution, and different also from the mechanisms leading to the Nicaraguan Revolution. Anybody want to name a difference among any of the three of those? From what you know about China, Russia, or Cuba. Yeah.
So like, famous example would be the Russian Revolution took place. You could think of it sort of as a revolution followed by a civil war, an insurrectionary seizure of power within like the sort of centers of governments and of state control, which then sort of led to this sort of not quite power vacuum, but a fracturing.
Mhm.
So the Civil War comes afterwards. In a certain sense, you have not exactly the opposite, but in the Chinese and Cuban scenarios, you have a revolution which is in some sense coterminous with the Civil War, or rather the Civil War is the earliest phase of the revolutionary action. So I don't know that much about the Chinese example and its like actual particularities, but according to its own theoretical doctrines, like you have this notion of protracted people's war, which is based around this sort of immersion within, like in this case, the peasantry, which allows for the development of class forces in the countryside that can then overwhelm the actual centers of state power. In Cuba, there is a similar scenario of developing a sort of small base, though it is less, thing is like it was less ideologically determined, their sort of strategy of action, but it was a similar sort of developing a base outside of the centers of state power, engaging in conflict with the armies of the state, and then eventually crushing them and taking control over those
Okay.
centers.
So we could actually, a lot of that is exactly what I was looking for. But we can say they're all called revolutions, and yet they're very different in terms of their etiology, the way in which they unfolded. I think you're right about the Russian Revolution, that it was more like a putsch than a genuine social revolution. It was not a mass-based revolution. When you say civil war came later, that's when masses of armies and populations and peasants and workers became substantially involved. So we can get the timing of when did masses get involved. We can notice the role of party in the different instances. Party is crucial, completely crucial in the case of the Chinese Revolution, the party organization, as a mechanism for coordination, control, and mustering. So that's a mechanism we can pursue. The fact of successful prior revolutions, both China and Russia, as examples for the Cubans, that changed the environment for Castro. Because ideologically and organizationally, there are other examples of revolutions, some positive, some negative. So the point I think that you're illustrating, and it's the one I was looking for, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity. Even in these 20th century revolutions, they show a lot of diversity in the causal processes, which led to, in those instances, successful revolutions. We could say similar things about unsuccessful revolutions. The effort at revolution in Germany after World War I, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and the communist opposition in Germany, which was aimed at creating revolution, but it failed. So that's a failed revolution. But the point I'm getting at is that we can get a lot of analytical clarity, not by asking what was in common, what were the generalizations we can discover in China, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Russia, but rather what are distinctive causal processes, mechanisms, instigating causes, processes of elevation of claims and claimants and so forth. And exactly as illustrated in dynamics of contention, we can come up with a long list of processes which are familiar from a number of different kinds of instances of collective action and collective rebellion. And Tilly certainly is arguing, and I would certainly support the idea, we have a much better understanding of revolution when we've disaggregated it in that way, or of civil war when we've disaggregated, or for that matter of civil unrest in cities, i.e. riots. If we just have a behavioral description of a riot, a time when lots and lots of people are out in the streets disregarding law and order and burning buildings, if that's our description of riots, well, some riots may be inter-ethnic riots like Hindu-Muslim pogroms in Bombay or Mumbai, maybe race riots like in Detroit and Newark, maybe trying to think of a rich-poor riot. Anybody have a good example of a rich-poor? Yeah, sure. In the 19th century in Britain, there were many disturbances which really frightened more upper-class British people. That working class people were no longer just, quiet. They were causing trouble. They were rising up. They were threatening. And so class became a source of social conflict. In all of those cases, what we're identifying are the beginnings of a causal mechanism's explanation of an outcome, or at least a causal mechanism's contribution, one portion of an explanation of the outcome. Now, most social events are complex. They have many parts, many moving parts. So asking the question, what was the social mechanism that led to the success of the communist revolution in China? There isn't really a correct answer to that question, because there were multiple processes underway, multiple factors which influenced the capacity for mobilization of large numbers of people. None of us has mentioned external warfare, and yet a major part of the Chinese Revolution was the Japanese incursion warfare against northeastern China, and then Shanghai and the rape of Nanjing and so forth. In other words, we can take the big complex event and we could ask ourselves, what is the explanation of that event? Well, there is no law-like explanation, but if we disaggregate a bit, we can arrive at an empirically defensible, historically defensible concatenation of causal mechanisms, which give us a pretty good understanding for why the Sandinistas prevailed and why the Radical Party in El Salvador did not prevail. In other words, we can do comparative studies. We can offer explanations for why one process of rebellion had success and another process did not. These are really large scale questions, but let's zoom in a little bit. And I wanted to have a number of, let's take a number of kinds of examples, but let's take one concrete example, corruption. So organizations and societies are said to be more or less corrupt. And what can you all speculate about what, where we might look to try to identify the mechanisms which differentiate one organization, let's say, let's see, what would be a pair of organizations to compare? What's the name of the drug manufacturer that just settled billions of dollars for the Sacklers? What's the name of that company? Their drug company.
I don't remember.
Yeah,
I just watched a documentary on it. I don't remember.
yeah. Anyway, they reached a solution, a class action resolution for several $1 billion. And then that was thrown out by a court. And I think in the last week or so, a $6 or $8 billion resolution has been agreed to instead. But somebody Google and figure out what the company is, so I don't have to call it Company X, the Sackler Drug Company.
I think it is Purdue Pharma.
Purdue, yeah, Purdue, that's it. Good. Nothing to do with Purdue University, though, I'm very happy to tell you. So Purdue Pharma, we might say, is on the more unethical range of the spectrum. I say that not in complete ignorance. I do have some reason for saying that. Because of documents that were released during these lawsuits in the past couple of years. And maybe we would say, let's see, who's a corporation that has a really high reputation for honest behavior? Is that a really tough question? Ben and Jerry's. It's funny you mentioned that, because I used that as an example earlier today. So, okay, Ben and Jerry's. What's the difference between, so we can ask the question. I'm not asking you, do you know the difference? But we can ask the question, what makes one company prone to dishonest and disreputable, unethical behavior, and the other company ready to sacrifice profits for the sake of its integrity and its valuing the public that it serves? What kind of mechanisms could you think of?
Perhaps governance structure.
Okay. So how could you flesh that out, do you think?
Yeah. I think Ben and Jerry's. Oh, do you have any specifics? Like what I think one could be more collectively owned. So either employees have some stake in the welfare of the company, or there's a rather flat kind of organization so that power is not concentrated in one place at the top of the company, whereas another might have that strong top-down model where there are a handful of people who really benefit from the well-being of the company compared to, I don't know, the middle management
Okay.
or even the regular laborers who are just they're grinding things out. They don't have a speak.
Good. Yeah, that's the kind of factor that I'm trying to ask us to sort of probe. What are the institutional arrangements in two different corporations, let's say, or organizations, such that one organization has a long-term pattern of unethical behavior, and another corporation has a long-term pattern of, basically high standards of ethical behavior. And your point, the mechanism you're referring to is ownership structure. You actually said management structure, but it's who benefits, right? That's really the point that you're making. So ownership structure would say, something like, if there's a very powerful conveyance from the economic interests of the owners to the organizational discipline of the organization to its practices, then maybe we would expect business rationality to trump social justice or ethical concerns. And therefore, we would expect a corporation with that kind of structure. I'm just trying to flesh it out a little bit. I'm not yet asserting that this is correct, though a very interesting study of IG Farben during the Nazi period comes to exactly that conclusion. IG Farben, as you may know, used upwards on 1 million slave laborers and concentration camp laborers. It provided the Zyklon B gas that killed over 1 million people in concentration camps. IG Farben, a chemical company, a conglomeration of chemical companies. And a very well respected book of business history by Peter Hayes basically comes to the conclusion that Farben's behavior is not to be understood in terms of the Nazi ideology of its CEO or its management, but rather by normal business rationality, that it made decisions about labor, about products based on simple calculations of profit and loss, what contracts it can get, and so forth. And yet the results were, obviously viciously evil, killing 1 million people or making it possible to kill 1 million people with Zyklon B, using huge numbers of slave laborers in the production process, et cetera. So we could identify that business rationality organization as being the mechanism through which possibly lofty intentions that are stated in the mission statement of the corporation get subverted by the actual behavior of the company. That's the kind of mechanisms like explanation I was trying to get to. That's not exactly corruption. So what is corruption? Anybody want to give a quick definition of corruption? What do you think corruption is?
Behavior that runs counter to the collective good of a particular social structure.
Well, okay, that sounds like it's in the right direction. What do you think about this? It's behavior which exchanges the services that an officer has in virtue of his position in exchange for private benefits. So the cop who stops you for speeding in Alabama, don't ever go to Alabama, sorry, you have prejudice about the state of Alabama, and expects a $100 bill to be folded into your driver's license. That would be corrupt behavior. If the $100 bill isn't there, then you get the ticket, maybe spend the night in jail. If it is there, you got a have a good evening and please slow down in the future. So that would be corrupt behavior. There would have to be some kind of signaling. If you were a northerner and didn't really know the local practice, we'd have to kind of figure that out, wouldn't we? How do you know that you're being offered an opportunity for a corrupt transaction?
The way they do it in the movies is very comical over it. Oh, I might be persuaded.
Uh-huh,
Are you sure this is your license?
uh-huh. So one possibility is kind of convention. If drivers know that street cops expect, in other words, what is convention? It's a mutual, it is by itself another social mechanism, convention. If we normally started at 6:10, then we all have the shared orientation towards the idea that we don't start before 6:10, and it then becomes impossible for me to start before 6:10 because, out of the 5 of you and the 2 on Zoom, you wouldn't be here until 6:10. So a convention can be a very powerful thing. And if you are you drive this road every day and you're an Alabama driver and you know what the convention is, that's kind of easy. And the high-minded lawyerly type who is really very opposed to corrupt behavior, who says, that's my driver's license, that's it, give me the ticket. That person is maybe on the rare side. The person who folds in the $20 bill, let's say, not a $100 bill, that person is going along with the convention and making a corrupt transaction. He's getting a benefit from the cop, and the cop is getting a benefit from him. It's not a market transaction because the cop can't say this is the price. I've got a price sheet here, but it's a conventional relationship. So that would be an example of corrupt behavior. Where else does corruption arise? I have a particular example in mind from the course I teach in the fall, which is about organizational causes of large technology failure. And one of my students last semester was a student who had a lot of experience in Chinese government. And her experience was in local government inspecting high-rise buildings for fire safety. And what was shared with me was that the low-level inspectors are just expected that they will be open to closing their eyes to the fact that there's no water pressure in the fire system, in the, what do you call it, the fire hose system, that it hasn't been pressurized. And the inspectors are willing to overlook that minor deficiency in fire safety. in exchange for a relatively small bribe. You'd have to know. And if some inspectors expect that and other inspectors are furious and slap their cuffs on you because it's a crime to offer a bribe to a state official, then corruption is more difficult. The question I'm getting at, I didn't actually want to have a good analytical definition of corruption so much as I wanted to have a causal mechanisms theory of why some regimes have high levels of corruption and other arrangements have low levels of corruption. So let's just take that example, building inspectors in New York City, let's say. Building inspectors can cause a lot of trouble for a building owner. And suppose that there has been, since the 1960s, a pattern of kind of low-level bribe paying to building inspectors. Can you think of an innovation that would make bribery less frequent, a lot less frequent in the building inspection world? I'm working around to a causal mechanisms.
I don't know about an innovation, but what about the structures in place to ensure like ethical behavior and compliance? You know,
Good.
like if there are strong punitive measures,
Good.
if you're caught engaging in
Oh, that's
corruption.
exactly what I'm looking for. So what you're describing is a mechanism, I would call it, an organizational change, which imposes more supervision over the inspectors and increases the likelihood of their being detected and punished. That's basically what you're thinking of, right, Devin?
Yep.
So the odd thing is about Zoom is I'm looking at you, but the camera is not, so eye contact is a problem. You're on my screen here. But in any case, okay, so that would be an intervention. How does that work? How does that mechanism work? So let's say that, what's the city, the New Jersey city right opposite New York? You hop on the tube, you go across to Hackensack, Newark, let's say Newark. It's not really Newark I'm thinking of, but let's say it's Newark. Newark and New York City had comparable high levels of building inspector bribery, let's say. And then there's an innovation in Newark, but not in New York, as suggested by urban policy consultant Devin. And the innovation is that they've added to the budget $500,000 in oversight supervision. Gotta make that stop. 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 They all ring, so turning off one device doesn't help. It's really awful.
I'm sorry.
Um,
No, did you notice that it looks like on you is she's using a filter to look like a potato? I don't know if that was intentional.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not sure. What is that filter, hung you?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a potato. There's no doubt about
Yeah.
it. It's a potato now that we see it better.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
Well, that's great. Well, I don't have a sweet potato on my end, so we'll have to go with live people on my end. So, okay, so we got this little experiment going, and Newark has introduced more intensive supervision and well-publicized program of punishment. And 6 or 8 inspectors have been sent to jail. And the rate of corruption has fallen off by 75%. We could call that causal, and we could call it a causal mechanism. It's a change in the organizational structure, the kind of the governance structure of Newark. It's now different from New York City, and it has a substantially better ability to discourage corruption. One would presume that in both systems, there was a training. Inspectors got a training early on. Never take a bribe. You can be prosecuted for taking a bribe. People can die if you take a bribe, so don't do it. The training didn't work. but the greater inspection maybe did work. How well does that work if you have one supervisor for 1,000 inspectors? Devin, we're pursuing your example further, so.
Not very well, I imagine.
So the innovation of just introducing one intensive supervisor is not likely to be a successful mechanism for controlling corruption. Good, right, okay, good. So I think we've got one good example about corruption. Are there other ways of making corruption less prevalent? What about positive training? I just said kind of a negative thing about training. Everybody gets training, everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die. It's an old country song. But in this instance, everybody gets training, but nobody becomes ethical, I was sort of implying. But can training actually, or can any communication from the city administration change the honesty level? What do you think? That's a really interesting question.
My immediate implication, application assumption is that like there would be a non-zero impact simply by virtue of like sensation of having that metaphorical big other over your head, right? That being said, had very mixed experiences in reality dealing with a lot of like how to be a better person training at jobs in the past. I worked at Starbucks for 3.5 years, and I don't know if y'all remember back in 2017 or 2018, there was that case where a couple of Black men were arrested for sitting in a Philadelphia Starbucks.
Right, it wasn't that long ago, actually.
And Howard Schultz responded by saying, we're going to shut down every
Right.
Starbucks for a day for anti-racial bias training. And I worked at a Starbucks location in New York, pretty liberal area, very racially diverse staff. And we all got summoned in and we had to watch like talks by the rapper Common on video, and we got to like, there was a racially and gender diverse panel where they asked questions like, for example, is Starbucks woke or is Starbucks waking up? That is a quote, that is not me making a joke. And then we had to do activities. And again, young, ostensibly liberal, racially diverse group of people I worked with. And I'm going to be honest, as soon as our manager left us to do the sort of anti-bias training activities, I've never heard more racist language in my life.
Really?
It was just like an opportunity to be like, oh, we're supposed to be actively not racist now. Let's just take every opportunity to offend as many people
That is horrible
at the
to hear.
table as possible. Hey, do you want to learn about all these different slurs about this ethnic group you didn't even know about? Hey, here's a cool stereotype for like 20 minutes until our manager came back. And that was just it. It was just, like, I think that there can be, a very strong sort of negative reaction to your social superiors trying to tell you to be a better person.
So there's an organization that a very famous person started at Access. Access, anybody ever hear of Access in Detroit area? It's called the Arab American Social Service Organization. Somehow it acronymizes to Access. But Rashida Tlaib, familiar name or not? Yeah, okay, so she's in Congress now. But before that, she was in the State House and she was an activist for Access, which is a an Arab American organization. And she and colleagues created an organization called Take on Hate. Take on Hate. And it was an active training organization for individuals to kind of learn how to address bigotry and intolerance against Muslims in particular, but Black-white racism, anti-Semitic racism, anti-gay racism, but not racism, but intolerance, all of these kinds of hatreds were within the scope of Take on Hate. And the really cool thing about Take on Hate is that it was training and it was kind of socialization, which actually worked. So you gave an example of training which had perverse effects. And I'm not quite sure why Take on Hate worked as positively as it did, except that it was done by peers, not by bosses. And it was pretty smart. There was, I got to try out their principles. Their principles are to very gently confront the person who's made a racist remark, not in an antagonistic way, but just in a kind of informational way. And so I did this training with them. I found it very interesting. And then I went into my local supermarket in Dearborn, and there was an Italian sauce maker that was giving samples, and it was called Dago sauce. And having done the training, I went up to the person, I said, you know, that's racist, that's disparaging. You shouldn't have that name on your sauce. And she said, oh, I didn't know that. She was just the marketing representative. You know how they give out free samples in food stores? That's what she was doing. She didn't work for the store. Anyway, I guess the point is, I did learn how to non-confrontationally address the issue when it occurred. That's kind of the idea, address it when it occurs. It had no effect at all. The young woman who was providing the samples had no idea what I was talking about, and I'm sure it didn't, I mean, obviously didn't change the corporate behavior. I would like to think, and I think maybe we could find some evidence that there are ways of altering the attitudes that people have towards work and consumers in the workplace, that it's not all negative sanctions. That's the point I'm wanting to try to get to, that there are positive sanctions as well, or positive inducements. Yeah, go ahead, Devin.
I think it's a matter of individual actors and their choices within like a group, a peer group, like whether or not, like I guess in the case of Starbucks, right? It's how like individuals choose to respond to that training, and then how their peers in turn respond to their actions, right? So if you have someone who chooses to respond negatively to the training, right, and starts making fun of it and doing even more racial slurs, like what is then going to be the response of the group? Are you going to check them for that bad behavior, or are you going to allow it? You know, I think in spaces where it does work, where you see this building of a positive culture, it's where you see that like positive reinforcement, right? Where it becomes part of like a group identity or a group point of pride, where you're like, you know, in our group, we take implicit bias very seriously, right? And it becomes like a point of pride. And I'm always watching Netflix, and I'm thinking about like the Newsroom. I'm sure some of you have probably seen it. It's like the Aaron Sorkin, super liberal, idealistic, whether you love it or hate it, whatever. But they definitely have this like cultural vibe going on of, you know, it's really important to be ethical, right? And like basically every episode is about them navigating different challenges and producing the news relating to ethics. And they're constantly like reinforcing one another in terms of like, you know, part of our group identity is we adhere to a very high standard of journalistic integrity and ethics. Yeah, again, I think it has something to do with the choices of individual actors and how they respond to these interventions. And then in turn, how the peers within their sphere of influence, within their like group identity, how they in turn respond to those actions in like the group context.
Okay, so for our purposes, you know, talking about causal mechanisms, it's just interesting to take this idea seriously and try to unpack it. But what Devin is putting forward is the idea that there are strategies for changing the mentality of a work group. There are strategies of bringing a work group to a higher level of positive attitudes towards each other, towards their jobs. Tilly actually said something very similar to this to me years ago when he visited the Dearborn campus. He was awarded an honorary degree. And I think I mentioned this before, but that he had left Michigan, he went to the new school. And he said, the new school, that was such a terrible place. The faculty were so cynical and they were so negative, and they're always bickering with each other, and they didn't like their students. And so I just walked down the street and I went over to Columbia. That I thought was very comical, because there's only like one person in a million who can leave his job at one very prestigious place and walk down the street and go to another very prestigious place. So he had some choice. But the cultural contrast that he's referring to, I think, is very real. Different universities have very different climates of faculty attitudes towards students. Just to take one example, there are universities where students are treated as being just sources of revenue. And there are other universities where students are treated as, you're the main reason we're here. Not our research, of course, we love our research, but we care about your progress, we care about you, we find you very interesting. Different institutions have different levels of engagement and I don't know, what would you call it? Motivational association with the success of their students. And you could ask yourself the question, just ask yourself the question, what are the mechanisms that lead to low social engagement between faculty and students at the new school and high engagement at, let's say, Colgate University, where I also used to teach. Not also, I didn't teach at new school, but where I did used to teach, where faculty were very, very smart, very research active, but they gave a huge amount of attention and caring and concern to the progress of their students. What accounts for those differences? Well, I think we could, if we were, sociologists of higher education, we could devote some attention to the question, what are some of the triggering mechanisms which lead to a high culture or a low culture when it comes to student, faculty engagement with students? Does that make sense or not? Or do you think it would just sort of all percolate out to homogenized milk, pretty much similar attitudes in all universities? Almost all of you, I don't think any of you were a Michigan undergraduate. Is that correct? Any of you a Michigan undergrad? Well, you are even. So, but the principle still holds. You don't have another institution to compare to. But most of you do have two institutions to compare to. Do you see a contrast like the one that I'm referring to between your undergrad institution and your grad institution? Faculty more caring and concerned about your progress versus less? Or is that too close to the bone to be honest about? It doesn't have to be about here. Yeah.
It's difficult to say because the amount of practice that I have in contact with here is very different from when I was an undergrad. Because I was taking courses from so many departments, the relations around faculty here are much more intimate and personal. In that way, it's difficult to say that I was paying attention at the broad level. It's similar.
Well, here's a data point, actually. I can take it from the personal to the world of data and research. But Liz Armstrong and a colleague did a book called Paying for the Party. Liz Armstrong is a faculty member, senior faculty member in sociology in this department. And she and her collaborator went and lived in a female dorm at a major Midwestern university. Thanks to an industry student of hers, I know which university that is. And the impression you get when you read this book is that it's an institution which is geared almost completely to its finances. It has very little real attachment to student progress, let alone social justice. Paying for the party refers to the fact that there's a real tracking system at this university so that students from lower income families wind up getting tracked into one kind of social life, and higher income students get tracked into kind of fraternity sorority life and different set of social contacts. There's a pair of women that they track, a lower income woman who becomes a dental assistant, and her very comparable fellow student in the same dorm, comparable grades, et cetera, becomes a dentist. So dental assistant, $32,000 a year, dentist, $260,000 a year. It's that kind of social tracking that they're primarily looking at. But one of the things that these observers are able to identify in that university is some of the markers of culture. What are the things that are valued, and then how are those valued activities conveyed to faculty and staff and students? In all the years that I've worked at Dearborn, which is now quite a few, this isn't a comment about faculty, though I have a similarly positive view of faculty, but the staff at Dearborn are very devoted to helping students succeed. And we get a lot of transfer students from Wayne State University. And as chancellor, I heard many students say, it's just astounding to me. At Wayne State, if I go into an office, they basically tell me to go away. If I go into the counterpart office here at Dearborn, they try to figure out how to help me. And it's a completely different environment. How does that happen? Well, we could try to identify what are the mechanisms which lead to those different orientations to job and to work and to behavior, to take one away from cynicism, away from self-interest. I think I've mentioned my least favorite sign that I see in a medical practitioner office. Just because you're having an emergency doesn't mean I'm having an emergency. How do you feel about that? I have actually seen that in a U of M. You're checking out, basically. So it's the checkout office, give us your paperwork, but it's basically, don't rush me. You may be in a rush, but I'm not. And it's a very negative attitude towards the consumer. And so the idea that you might have is, well, what is the morale of the staff workers in that office? It seems like it's pretty low. What is the morale of the 18-year-old Russian soldier in Ukraine today? I imagine you're reading a lot of newspaper articles about the war in Ukraine. It seems, from everything I've read in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other publications, it's really hard to breathe through this mask when you're talking. One hyperventilates. I wish I had brought my little thing, the oximeter thing. I might be down to 92% at this point. If I can remember, I'll clip that out of the tape. I don't want to give the impression I'm fainting up here. But the impression that I have in war reporting is that morale in the Russian army is extremely low, partly because of what the soldiers, the conscript soldiers were told. What they were told was, A, this is a training exercise. B, it'll be over in a week. C, there's no risk. This is an opponent that will simply walk right over. And D, you'll be home by, I don't know what the next religious holiday is in the Russian Orthodox calendar, but you'll be home very soon. So they were told a bunch of lies. And I don't know if you've seen these videos of abandoned tanks and field guns and the evidence of soldiers just leaving their equipment and walking away. That is a material factor in warfighting. And then the question is, what are the factors? What are the causal factors which lead to either high morale? Ukrainian soldiers have very high morale right now, apparently, and Russian soldiers have very low morale right now. And that is, in turn, a mechanism leading to very, very poor military performance. So in a sense, we've got now a linkage of a couple of mechanisms. We've got the mechanism as yet unspecified, what leads to low morale of the infantry soldier. or the armored cavalry. I don't know what they call them in Russia. In the US, I think they're called armored cavalry, tank people. What are the factors, what are the mechanisms which lead to either high or low morale in the military? That's one mechanism question. And then the second mechanism question is, why does low morale lead to poor performance on the battlefield? And we could account for, we could give a kind of a spelling out of how each of those mechanisms works, I think. Thinking of other examples, I'm sure that you're aware that all of the military analysts are very surprised at how strongly the Ukrainian forces have been able to, I mean, they're not winning, but they're also not losing very fast. Stop it. How do I do that? Let them to stop. There we go. Good. Bridgeton, New Jersey. Anybody know anybody in Bridgeton, New Jersey? Now I have the ringer turned off, but still my watch rings. Israel, in several of its wars since 1948, was badly outnumbered, but had fighting capability which was substantially more effective than the enemies that it was fighting against. So morale seems like it's not a material factor, but it seems like a causally relevant factor for influencing the outcome of military conflict. I do have a friend, a Chinese-American friend, who was in China in the 70s and got sick in Southeast China in the mountains, and he was in a hospital. And this was at the time of the Chinese incursion into Vietnam. And it has always stuck with me what my friend said to me, because he was able to speak good Chinese. He said, these Chinese soldiers were almost supernaturally afraid of the Vietnamese troops that they had been fighting, because the Vietnamese troops were so fierce. It wasn't that the Chinese troops were not good soldiers, but the Vietnamese troops were so passionate and committed and fearless that they inspired terror, basically in kind of normal infantry units among Chinese soldiers. It's just kind of interesting. But again, the question I'm kind of asking you to think about is multiple examples of causal mechanisms that we can piece together to explain important outcomes. So corruption, I talked about. I think I had a couple of other interesting, oops. That's not what I wanted. There we go, good. Oh, tax collection. That would be the third example. There's a person who's written a lot about corruption in the developing world. His name is Robert Klitgaard, and his book is called Controlling Corruption. And I've always admired that book since the 1990s, because it is exactly the kind of meso-level analysis of corruption in different countries, African countries, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and East Asian countries, with regard to things like police corruption, tax corruption, and tax collection. And what Klitgaard tries to identify are the organizational differences between Hong Kong police and Singapore police, for example, organizational differences, which in the 1980s led to high levels of corruption in Hong Kong and very low levels of corruption in Singapore. And it's very, very interesting, because it is, again, a causal mechanisms theory. It is that I should have kind of gotten more, well, I can't get more detailed because all my books are in dear form. And I haven't seen them in several years because of the pandemic. And that book is one of them. But his view is basically that organizationally, Hong Kong police system did not have appropriate institutional controls so that police corruption was rampant. Whereas Singapore police, they were the same kind of people. It's not that Hong Kong policemen were inherently corrupt and Singapore policemen were inherently honest. It's rather the institutional arrangements in which they found themselves under the same inducements led to a much lower level of corruption in Singapore than in Hong Kong. Again, it's a causal mechanisms theory or explanation of an important outcome. Important why? Why is it important to identify the mechanisms that either lead through their presence to low corruption or possibly counterfactually lead through their absence to high corruption? Why is that an important question? We want an explanation, but we want something else too. What's the other thing we want? Yeah, policy. We want to be able to intervene. So if we were the Hong Kong police consultant, we would want to travel to Singapore, see the arrangements that have been made in Singapore, and then see, are these feasible in the Hong Kong police force? This is actually the, it's right at the core of the interest of the book that I published in 2020 called A New Social Ontology. I think you read several chapters. Yeah, you read several chapters of it. But the whole idea there is to identify dysfunctions of organizational arrangements that lead to perverse outcomes. And those dysfunctions, every single one of those dysfunctions can be understood as a mechanism. So the dysfunction of industry capture, for example, the dysfunction that Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a hard time carrying out inspections of power plants, nuclear power plants in Ohio. Why is that? Well, it turns out it's because the owner of the plants has a lot of political clout, which is then able to pressure the commissioners of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who in turn pressure the inspection regime to cut some slack. They also offer kind of an ideological theory, a Republican theory. Less regulation is better. Even in catastrophically dangerous technologies, figure that out. So in other words, sources of dysfunction are themselves potential mechanisms for bad outcomes. And we can identify those failures of communication. Trying to think of an example. One of the dysfunctions I have in mind is conflicting priorities between two different divisions. So let's see if we can figure that out. I don't know, top-ranking police officers have an interest in suppressing violent crime rates because it's politically harmful for them to have, more murders this year than last year. And street cops have a different incentive. They have different priorities, and the different priorities lead to different actions. And by having those different actions at the top of the organization and at the bottom and middle of the organization, we may get perverse interactions, which mean that suppression of crime is even more difficult. Again, that would be a causal mechanisms theory. Okay, well, this is a good time to take a break and come back at 25 minutes till the hour. Would be really unfortunate. Motion sick by moving it around so much. Okay.
So I'm going to present on the growth matters, the theory of social mechanisms. And I'm going to first the argument of this piece. Growth argues that existing accounts of social mechanisms are problematic because they are not either an so two concepts are central to this piece. One is action and the other is social mechanism. And in opposition to a variety of other theories, action in fact should be conceptualized in terms of social practices and not rational definition of means to end as what rational choice theory holds, but creative enactment over time of social practices. And we will see a better definition of social practices in a minute. And another concept is social mechanism. It is understood as chains or aggregations of problem situations and also the effects that's into and as a result of the habits that actors use to resolve them. So now we have a question: what is a social mechanism? So builds this argument by first asking this question and then digging into 5 various conceptualizations that have appeared in recent years. So for other theories, we're saying, and he also discusses the definitions of social mechanisms and the major points on which people agree and also disagree. So those are the main points that people agree. That includes social mechanisms are causal in the way that they mean between cause and effect. And the process, as a social mechanism, has to do something with the social elements and not just the scientific one. And also social mechanism echoed in time. And this temporal sequence of events or processes occurring in the social world can be at the micro, meso, or macro levels. And also the duration of the sequences can vary greatly. It could be years or decades or also centuries. And also social mechanisms are general, although they vary in degrees. In Tillis' example, the focus is on mechanisms invoked to explain particular events, like historical events. And those mechanisms can also be personal, like the mechanism that can explain how a person grows up in the neighborhood with a high degree of social disorganization turns to a life of crime. And there are also points on which theorists disagree. And the oppositions can be methodological individualism versus social ontologism. So for Hastrom and Slatberg, the analysis of mechanisms should focus on processes centered on individual level action, but the critical realists who take a social ontologist position, for them it is acceptable to study social mechanisms without much concern for the individual level phenomena by which they come about. And another opposition could be formal versus substantive mechanism. Formal would be how the causal relationship between X and Y comes about because of the formal structural characteristics of social relations involved. An example of that could be Berg's analysis of social capital advantages appear to actors whose network ties that the structural holes other actors encounter. It does not matter that much what content that this structural hole represents, but more that's it's the structural feature that is the center of this kind of analysis. And another opposition could be analytical versus realist models. And the questions that, so different questions are pursued by those theories. So it's the goal to produce models that allow for elegant and robust predictions, whether or not the postulated mechanisms can be shown to be present and operative in reality, or should we seek to identify mechanisms that are empirically observable. So those are different objectives that theorists pursue and also achieve. And amongst different opinions, Gross offers a definition of social mechanism that is more or less general sequence or set of social events or processes analyzed at a lower order of complexity or aggregation, by which some cause X tends to bring about some effect Y in the realm of human social relations. So it encompasses the points that people agree on and also trying to navigate through the oppositions. And a question that is natural in this setting is that why is this formulation better than the previous ones? Gross defends this argument by pointing out problems with current formulations of social mechanisms. And one is that some work seeks to identify relatively abstract features of mechanisms, but falls short of laying out a fully developed theory of them. And the example could be Raskin's work that offers a characterization of the mechanism, but actually does not discuss or provide much detail about the workings of the mechanisms. And a second problem with current formulation would be that in rational choice theory, those work is built on assumptions about action, but those assumptions are not empirically verified. And the assumption that rationality as like innate and more or less equally distributed cognitive capacity, and the assumption that most action is motivated is not persuasive or supported by empirical evidence. So a challenge here would be that we want to explain how a variety of social practices build on and intersect with social practices with action theoretical foundations. And a solution that Close proposes is that a theory of social mechanism on the basis of an approach to social action can solve this problem. So now we take a closer look of the pragmatist theory of action. And the central concept to this theory comes in two parts. One is habit and the other is meaning. So for habits, well, the main way of humans solve problem is by enacting habits. And here, habits means those learned through social experience or from previous individual efforts as a problem solving. And more specifically, it's acquired predispositions to ways or modes of response, modes of which actors are typically not conscious in the moment. And it's only when pre-existing habits fail to solve those problems that's the rest to the consciousness and also new habits that need to be developed. And the second part of this is meaning. This is also central to the pragmatist view of action. In this last problem, situations present themselves to actors through the lenses of the cultural environments in which they are immersed. And such environments give meaning to and help provide the content of the goals, orientations, identities, vocabularies of motive and other understanding of action situations that actors come to have. So all the habits are enacted on the basis of culturally mediated interpretations of the situation that actors face. And what could also be helpful for understanding pragmatist theory is by contrasting this with a bunch more theoretical traditions. And one of them is utilitarianism. So pragmatism does not equate problem solving with maximization of utility, which is what utilitarianism assumes. And also actually is habitual and typically involves no conscious weighing of means and ends. So the instrumental rationality itself, which is what utilitarianism goes on, is understood as a kind of habit by pragmatist theory of action. So it's just a way that some humans can learn to respond to certain situations. And we should be as interested in the historical processes by which the habit of rationality developed and its situation will be deployed as we should be in its effects. And another contrast that is helpful to make is pragmatism versus rational choice theory. So for rational choice theory, it leaves little room for cultural interpretation of phenomena, but for pragmatic theory, problem situations are always interpreted through cultural lenses, and the means and ends are not always given prior to action. They are instead emerged from action. So So Gross also makes the contrast between pragmatic theory and group two, who places emphasis on the strategic dimension of action. By strategic, actually we mean that it emphasizes actors' interests in leveraging themselves into favorable positions in the hierarchical social structure. But for pragmatic theory, factors of identity, morality, or condition are not residual, but coexisting or of equal importance as the strategic concerns over social position. So after a pragmatic theory of action, now we take a closer look at the pragmatic theory of mechanisms. And just wanted to remind you that we have defined before social mechanisms as composed of chains or aggregations of actors confronting problem situations and mobilizing more or less habitual responses. Here is a more formal definition of social mechanisms. So social mechanism is the process S by which some input I leads to outcome O. And to construct or have a social mechanism, we need to understand why and how, when confronted with problem situation Tn and endowed with habits of cognition action, Hn, along with other resources response, Rn becomes the most likely. And the chain or aggregations of actors confronting problem situations and mobilizing more or less habitual responses is the relations A to E to H and to R. And in aggregate, they bring about the I-O relationship, and I is the input, O is the outcome. An example of this definition of social mechanism could be that for a study of African American men and the effects of a criminal record as negative credentially on the likelihood of gaining employment is that A would be employers trying to meet staffing needs with reliable workers, and the problem situation P could be prevailing social, juridical, cultural structures. And H, the habits of cognition and action would be potential employees are coded in terms of trustworthiness depending on their race and history with the justice system. And the response R would be that discriminatory allocation decisions or negative credentialing. So from A to P to H to R, this is the process and the social mechanism that we are concerned about. Okay, another point to add is that the study of social mechanism must be undertaken alongside a project of cultural interpretation. And here, Merton's example of a bank run could be helpful. So the bank run is the phenomenon when many clients withdraw their money from a bank because they believe the bank may cease to function in the near future. And it's self-fulfilling in the sense that if many people withdraw their money from that, then actually the bank will cease to function. And the cultural interpretation comes in because from the pragmatic theory of social mechanisms, the belief that a bank is or is not solvent and its solvency has implications for whether actors should withdraw their deposits. So the presuppositions involved can include that actors understand what a bank is, what it means to say an institution like a bank can have solvency, and also actors see themselves and others as oriented towards the maximization of their short-term individual interests, and that they had enough trust in the institutional order to place their money in a bank in the first place, and that they have a climate to a system of monetary exchange. And so those are the cultural interpretations in a social context that need to be licensed. in order to acquire or assume needs. So what this implies is that mechanisms cannot be adequately understood without analysis of such assumptions, and the study of social mechanisms must be undertaken alongside the project of cultural interpretation. So that comes to the end of the presentation.
Great,
Thank
nice, very nice presentation. Could you go back to the first slide? So reactions to either the article or to Lou's response, interpretation of the article. Any reactions that people have? I went back here because I think both parts of this are important. The pragmatist or kind of pragmatic theory of the actor is an important addition, I think, to a rational choice model, but I think it requires more reflectiveness than Gross is given. So I'd like to have a little bit of conversation about that topic, because as it stands, he makes actors sound pretty mechanical, that they have habits, and then their habits are triggered. In a weird way, he sounds almost like a behaviorist, that routines are triggered by circumstances, and then the mechanism is the outcome of that triggering of several habits. That's probably not an adequate theory of the actor, though it may be an important part of a theory of the actor. So that was one question I wanted to raise. And then I also have a question about the fact that what he's describing is a minute segment of what a mechanism might be. This AHRN, or I've forgotten the sequence exactly, but it's one very, very small instance of what a mechanism might be. But I would say that even in Gross's own work, his book about Richard Rorty, for example, and the evolution of Richard Rorty's career as a philosopher, if we had read that book and then kind of tried to analyze it in terms of intellectual or mechanisms of intellectual shaping, which he identifies, they can't be accommodated to that small version of action or of mechanism, though that habitual kind of action does show up in the Rorty book. So it's one small piece, it does show up in his work, but there are much larger. I don't think any of the examples we talked about concerning corruption and honesty in organizations and so forth, I don't think very much of that can be accommodated to this theory of what a social mechanism is. So those were the two thoughts which I had. Any comments people want to make about that? What do you think about the theory of the actor? I think you did a very accurate job of describing his theory of the actor, but now we want to be, kind of thoughtful critics and decide, is this good enough? Rational choice theory is not good enough. Is this really an alternative to rational choice theory? Or is it a component of a richer, broader theory of the actor, which is kind of the way I would prefer to think about it. Not as an alternative, but rather as a component of a richer theory. Did you have a comment?
That was if we had started with the round robin, that was something that I was going to raise. I think Abbott made the point in the shorter the article that we read today to say that change is the norm and that stasis is the exception, right? And I was having a very hard time reconciling that with Gross's reliance on habit as a central component to social mechanisms. And I was going to ask, is there a difference, the distinction between habits and a state of stasis or?
Yeah, and I see the connection I think you're making, that if I as an actor act habitually, then I act the same way.
Right.
in, similar circumstances. So it's kind of stasis. It's
Right.
the same
Right.
stuff. But what it doesn't permit is creativity
Yeah.
and intentionality and a clever reorientation of my behavior to bring about an unexpected outcome, which other non-rational choice theories of the actor, like Bourdieu, think is completely essential. I've got a nice quote I want to put up once we have exhausted finishing talking about the slides. But this seems to swing the pendulum of actor theory too far in the direction of robots. The actor is simply programmed as a system of learned habitual responses to problem situations. That's just not good enough, given that we do understand that human beings, and what's very ironic about it is the pragmatism emphasizes two things: habitual behavior and creativity and spontaneity. But they're not compatible, or they're not compatible as one concept. They are compatible if you think that they are, it's almost like if you're able to program an AI device to answer certain routine questions with a stock answer, and then it has to do more calculation to come up with a more. You ever have the experience where Alexa says, "Well, I can't answer that, but I can tell you what the web says"? That's not a very useful answer. Do others of you ask your AI assistant to answer questions for you? Is that something you do?
I refuse.
Well, my wife refuses completely. She won't have one in her house, so she's with you.
Last time I had to get a new roommate, the one condition was that there would be no such thing.
Well,
in the common space.
You would be a very welcome roommate to my wife, I guess. She is completely opposed to Alexa and Google, whereas I have both Alexa and Google in my bedroom.
Oh my gosh.
I can ask them both questions.
I'm assuming you don't
But-
sleep talk then.
What's that?
I'm assuming you don't sleep talk. Like
I don't sleep talk. That's a good point. Though once in a while, the weird thing is that either Alexa or Google does sometimes
Yeah.
answer things
I'm
which
sorry, I didn't catch that. even though you
haven't
don't
been
say
asked.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
well, didn't catch is one thing, but
Yeah.
actually giving an answer to something that wasn't asked, it's a little more worrisome. But so that was one thing I wanted to focus on. And then the other thing is the question of, it's kind of weird because Gross, in one sense, is being a kind of radical contributor to mechanisms theory, and he's kind of wanting to push the envelope. But in another sense, he seems like kind of conservative theorist. Conservative in the sense that he's pulling back to a very simplified theory of the actor and also a very stripped down theory of what a mechanism is. That it's only one thing, as opposed, I don't think he could accommodate most of the items that we identified as potentially mechanisms in corruption and tax collection and so forth, organizational features. Hard to see how those would fit in. Short view, which I would attribute to Bourdieu and also to a richer theory of the actor. And there are a number of posts in which I try to argue for a richer theory of the actor, is that actors are purposive and intentional, but that doesn't mean that they're rational maximizers of something. Rather, they take account of the value of the outcomes that they're looking for and the meanings. You very rightly, and Gross rightly emphasizes meaning. If we were executives at Farman, the meaning that it has to employ slave laborers would completely erase the possibility that it's the best economic solution to the labor shortage problem. I'm pretty sure we would all agree about that. The meaning, the kind of ethical environment of slave labor makes the economic advantage of slave labor completely irrelevant. But that's not an economic calculation. That's ethical. It's historical. It's about human dignity. In other words, it's a meaning and culture item. And yet it could be highly productive, highly generative of behavior, I would like to say. Though, possibly other people would disagree with that. But the people's motivations can be driven by the meanings that they attribute to the actions which they're considering. I can either be a farm executive, maximize the rate of return, and employ 100,000 slave laborers, or I can have a loss for the whole World War II, but never employ slave labor. Some companies made that decision, but Farman did not make that decision. And we can ask the question, why is that? Okay, nice presentation. Before we go on to Ethan, I think I'm going to throw up the
I'm going to stop here.
yeah, the slides were so good, but I think, yeah, you can take it down. But we've got them captured on the video in any case. So, here. And post it. So this is one of the posts in which I talk about a richer theory of the actor. But what I wanted to, well, here are a couple of preliminary questions. What would we like to answer about the human actor? What are the questions which a theory of the actor ought to be able to respond to? What motivated the action? What was the actor thinking? What was the actor feeling? What beliefs were highlighted in conscious thought? What memories played a role? What rules of thumb, habits, a rule of thumb is a habit. What rules of thumb did the actor use? What emotional stream occurred? How did the actor process emotions? Did he or she act on the anger or suppress the anger? What scripts were salient? What is a script? Well, a script is kind of a stylized way of handling a particular problem, basically. A case which I consider someplace else in the blog is how a fire chief, an experienced fire official, handles a very complex fire with some toxic stuff. He's got a team of 20 firefighters, and there's some people in the house and so forth. In other words, a complex firefighting problem. His choices are a very interesting combination of training, which is habit, basically. So he's got some learned habitual responses, but also spontaneous response to changing circumstance, creativity, in other words. And a good fire chief or fire captain, fire captain would be the kind of leader, the really excellent fire captain will have both those things. He or possibly she will have both good training for him, herself, and the fire staff. So that's habitual practices. And then also we'll realize we're told normally get everybody 100 feet away, but in this particular instance, this explosive stuff is dynamite. So 100 feet is not enough. We need to move them 500 feet away. That would be a creative adaptation to the circumstance. So this is we're right. And then I kind of suggest 4 different approaches to the theory of the actor: desire, belief, opportunity. Remember, that's the theory that Hedstrom provides in dissecting the social. Desire, belief, opportunity. It's kind of a slightly loosened version of rational choice theory. What do you want? What do you believe? What are the opportunities? And then you act accordingly. Secondly, emotional dynamics of psychology and action. So the role that emotion and meaning play in action. Habits, practice, context, and performance. and then an environment scanning and making use of rules of thumb. But here's the package that I wanted to refer to Bourdieu's. So Bourdieu, some of you have read Bourdieu, but I think not all. But it's the book Outline of a Theory of Practice. So Bourdieu was a really influential French sociologist. And he wrote numerous books. One of his earlier and highly influential books is called Outline of a Theory of Practice. And there he offers a theory of practical agency, how individuals choose to act in a social environment. And he refers to it as habitus, individuals acting in a habitus. So I want to read a couple of passages. The habitus, the durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisation. You notice that interesting phrase, regulated improvisation? It's got the habitual side of your presentation, but it also has the improvisational side. Regulated improvisation produces practices which tend to reproduce the regularities imminent in the objective conditions of the production of their generative principle. And I won't continue because the words become a little confusing. In practice, it is the habitus. History turned into nature. That's actually also a kind of a pregnant phrase, a kind of an interesting phrase. It has a lot of suggestions which aren't really spelled out. History turned into nature, which accomplishes practically the relating of these two systems of relations in and through which the production of practice. So now, I still haven't got to the part that I wanted to share with you. What I understand by this concept of habitus is a more fluid conception of thinking, experiencing, doing. Thinking, experiencing, doing on Bourdieu's part than is characteristic of the more Aristotelian conception. The Aristotelian conception is, it's really the heart of rational choice theory. It's the idea, I have a clear set of objectives, a clear, rationally defined set of beliefs about the world, and then I do those things which will bring about my objectives. That's the Aristotelian view. This more fluid conception of Bourdieu's is, to me, very appealing. There's a suggestion of a sort of tacit knowledge underlying activity. What the fire chief knows about fires, with action looking as much like the smooth, intelligent motions of a soccer player as a deliberative chess master. Again, I find that a suggestive phrase, even though it's my own words. But the fact that this is a skilled performance, which is cognitive, and it's in the fingers too. That fire chief is reacting correctly based on both knowledge and practice and habit and spontaneity. It is a less epistemic view of the human condition, less a concoction of explicit beliefs and reasonings than a smooth coordination of tacit understandings and movements in the situation. It is less about deliberation and decision and more about intelligent doing. Intelligent doing is a perception of a situation and then a response to the situation, which is partly cognitive, partly habitual, partly intuitive is kind of a word that doesn't take us very far, but intuitive comes to my mind anyway. But okay, so here's the quote which I really like from Bourdieu. If witticisms, this is the indented paragraph, if witticisms surprise their author no less than their audience, and impress as much by their retrospective necessity as by their novelty, the reason is that the trouvé appears as the simple unearthing, at once accidental and irresistible of a varied possibility. It is because the subjects do not, strictly speaking, know what they are doing. What they do has more meaning than they know. So what he's describing is something very familiar. The words are a little bit confusing, but it's when you're listening to a person who's giving a public speech, not a canned public speech, got the, what do you call it? The prompter, teleprompter, not reading the teleprompter, but telling a story and making a point. There's so much spontaneity in public speaking, which has to do with thoughts and responses to the audience, and then beginning a story that has a point, but possibly you don't know in advance what the point is exactly. That's actually what he's dwelling on here. It's about intentionality getting born through the action. And to me, that's very powerful because it's a very different conception of action and the actor. It denies the separation between, okay, I've got a plan, I've got an algorithm, I've got a plot for what I'm going to do. That's the intellectual and cognitive part. And then I execute my plan. And that's just routine. That's just growth. He's denying that completely. Rather, it's a smooth, fluid combination of acting, thinking, doing. There was a, and then I'm going to turn to the but what I like about this, well, one thing I like about Gross and Abbott, likewise, is that they're both asking us to take a broader look at what action is, and then how action plays into social patterns, social outcomes, what we can explain once we have a better theory of social action. Yeah, here we go. I showed you this video, I think last week or a couple weeks ago. Didn't I show you this tennis video? Did you see this tennis video? So this is, in a way, it's kind of related to this topic about fluid activity, but it's on the topic of skilled bodily capacities. And this is a super famous tennis star. I think he's Spain's most famous tennis star. And I use it as an example. I thought it was kind of a humorous example. He's showing enormous skill in the serve, followed by falling down. And so I was kind of thinking, this kind of illustrates that action doesn't always work out correctly. I showed it to my other class, though, in Dearborn. They looked at the video a few times, and then they said, Professor, you've misinterpreted this video. The whole thing is skilled performance, including the falling down. Now, that's an interesting observation. Their view was this falling down is not an accident. It's just the continuation of kind of a last-ditch effort to return the, return the ball coming across the net. In other words, it's not clumsiness. It's a body under control crashing to the ground. It's just interesting because it does kind of illustrate that bodily fluid decision-making, opportunism, paying attention to changing circumstance, figuring out what can I do with my left hand or my right hand with the racket? Can I reach that ball? Can I reach it with my feet? And none of those thoughts being completely explicit and yet being cognitive. And that's actually the purpose of this this blog post. It's a group of people in Germany who introduced me to the cognition that's associated with skilled bodily performance. But I found it interesting because I think it's also relevant to skilled public speaking or skilled fire captain work or skilled, emergency response. We had a training at Dearborn a number of years ago where the chief emergency director for Wayne County came and gave us kind of a training and how to prepare ourselves as a leadership group and then a bigger group for how to help the campus respond to an unexpected emergency. And emergencies are generally unexpected. But the interesting thing, which he said as he was leaving the room, was you're all very smart people, but I just want you to know when emergency strikes, your IQ goes down 20 or 30 points. Meaning you have to practice, you have to have habits for what to do when bad circumstances arise. Okay, I am now ready for Ethan on Epic. I don't need to, yeah, right, there's nothing to show, so you're up.
Okay, so I'm presenting about mechanisms. The reading begins with this note to the reader that I found amusing, but it basically includes two important details. The first is the context in which the paper was drafted. And basically, he was writing for a conference, and he's a bit miffed that people who were editing the proceedings for the conference afterwards left out his manuscript, as he felt like they were sort of, they had ideological disagreements. but
And you noticed who that was, though. It was Hedstrom.
Right.
The author of analytical sociology and the co-author of causal mechanisms. So it's completely insulting. I agree with you completely, Ethan.
And it's, I mean, if you read what follows, there is sort of this biting criticism of Hedstrom, so it starts to make more sense why they might not include the paper in the conference proceedings. But if you look at the next piece of information, and what I thought was especially interesting was why he chose to focus on college admissions as the primary example in the paper. And he clarifies that he was a college dean at the time, and he was trying to defend the University of Chicago's traditions against a new president that was taking the university in a new direction that he didn't agree with. And so he claims that the university president was thinking about the situation in terms of mechanisms while he was thinking about it in terms of relations. And that the obviously wrong mechanisms-based thinking was what accounted for his fatal policy. And basically he goes on to talk about how his predictions were borne out and that president ruined the University of Chicago and there aren't any more quirky, nerdy students there anymore, but instead just corporate drones. And so he says, he muses, well, maybe this vindicates my thinking about relations versus mechanisms, or maybe there was just some kind of weird cultural moment where all of the quirky students were eliminated from the applicant pool. So from there, turning to the actual paper, he begins by presenting the opposing view. And he says that he's going to consider two perspectives on mechanisms. The first being Elster, the famous sociologist, and the second being Hedstrom and Swetberg. And he contrasts them. But I think ultimately, his point ends up being that they are much more similar than even they would like to admit. So in talking about Elster's view, he says that Elster motivates it in terms of mechanisms' role as an intermediate form of explanation between laws and descriptions. So there's sort of this idea that there are social laws, so there's sort of universal generalizations of the sort that you might find in the natural sciences that govern all social phenomena. And given that it seems to be accepted among these thinkers that those are impossible to discover, then there's this sort of temptation to say, okay, well, I guess there can be no social science. It's just, one damn thing after another in the social world. And all we can offer are these sort of detailed narrative descriptions, almost like novels. And so Elster's saying, well, no, there actually is a role for science. And there is a role for science short of laws, but employing generalizations that are stronger than mere narrative descriptions. And that is what he calls mechanisms. So it's a compromise position. So we can discover non-vacuous generalizations that govern recurrent phenomena in the social world. And Elster winds up reading this type of thinking, so social explanations in terms of mechanisms, into all of these influential thinkers from history, so Tocqueville, Aristotle, Hume, and also some more recent thinkers like Kahneman and Tversky. And so he gives examples of mechanisms that are widely accepted in the field today, so endowment effects, crowding out, conformism versus anti-conformism. And he also points out that you can give a stage theory of revolution in terms of the interplay of mechanisms. So the whole idea is that rather than being a narrative that involves a whole bunch of highly contingent local factors, instead you have a bunch of modular mechanisms that are all basically these sort of generalizations that you can test from context to context. And you can explain a complex phenomena in terms of just a sequence of these mechanisms playing out. And you say that these happen to recur over and over again. But you still think that there is contingency because you don't know necessarily when these modular mechanisms are going to be triggered. And there is some question as to the scope of the modular mechanisms and explaining all of the precise details of the particular revolutions as they play out, to return to that example. And so he concludes that section talking about Elster, and turns to Hedstrom and Swedberg and says that they motivate mechanisms quite differently. They claim that basically a lot of what passes for theory and sociology is vacuous, and that basically, even though mechanisms used to be more popular, sociologists have been turning away from mechanisms and they need to get back on track. They even go further than Elster, who it seems like they're sort of the implication is that Elster is thinking about, well, it would be nice if we could discover covering laws, but unfortunately we can't, so we have to settle for mechanisms. But there's still, we can basically try to use mechanisms as an imperfect substitute. Meanwhile, it seems like the view that's being attributed to HS is that mechanisms are actually better than covering laws. Covering laws just merely serve to help you predict phenomena, but mechanisms go farther and they give you the sort of fine-grained details. So that relates to the conversation we were having last week about the limits of correlational analysis. The idea being that that in the sense that these sort of universal instantiation of types, this form of explanation is common in the natural sciences, may even be less satisfying than a lot of the mechanistic explanations that you can give in the social world. And so now where the editor starts to get a bit more tendentious and starts making claims about Hedstrom and Elster's views that I think those authors would disagree with, is he starts saying that both of them sort of see the heart of the matter as reduction. So they think that it's all about methodological individualism, and how saying that there are sort of these elementary causal agents and that those are the actors in the social world, and that everything can be explained in terms of the interplay of those elementary causal agents. And that basically the foundation of social explanation should always be individual humans, and the adequate level of explanation is individual human decision-making. And they're basically highly dismissive of super individual mechanisms, and they very much like rational choice-based theories. And that basically they go even further in saying that not only is it the individual human, but the way to conceptualize the individual human is basically as a biological unit, a biological individual. So the sort of thing that you might study in evolutionary theory when you're trying to give an account of natural selection. And so Abbott turns and basically contrasts this mechanisms-based approach and its emphasis on reduction with what he calls a relational view. So, and he says that, in truth, these views are probably much more similar to each other than the impression that you would get if you were reading his paper, but that he's sort of exaggerating in order to make the contrasts more stark. His claim is that relations think that the meaning of actions is only comprehensible in a social context, so in a particular social time and a social place. And so we should think about actions in terms of their relations to other actions. So where are they in a sequence of actions, and where are they as sort of this vertex that drives the sequence of actions that are proceeding later on? And that basically, if we're thinking about the primitives in the theories that we develop, the right primitives are actions rather than actors. And so that when we're trying to analyze the social processes, we should start by looking at actions, and then something to be explained, something that we can develop an account of post-theory, is the actors themselves. And so, and another way of putting this is that interaction is more fundamental than biological units in social science explanations. And so basically, rather than thinking, basically the way actors are created by social processes, at least the relevant actors, the relevant social actors. And so they're not biological individuals, but in fact, they are social individuals that are molded by the interchanges that they have with one another. And that basically he thinks it's sort of just a dogma of the mechanistic thinking that the biological coherence of individuals is more natural or more important to social science than the social coherence of individuals. And so he basically, a point that was raised earlier and that is important to Abbott, is that mechanisms has trouble thinking about change, and that relations have trouble when you're dealing with stability. And this is true at almost every level, both in terms of the accounts that they'll offer of individuals, the accounts that they'll offer of different processes, and the accounts they'll offer of the evolution of different societies throughout history. But that, so his view is that social actors are constituted by the actions that they perform or take part in. Now, having established the two views, he wants to illustrate this difference by providing some examples. So he offers an extended analysis in the context of endowment effects, but I'm going to skip over that for now. I'm going to focus on his second example, which is applying some of the lessons from the more extensive analysis that he does to college admissions, which he sort of teased at in the note to the reader. So the example that he gives is that UChicago's president wanted to attract higher quality undergraduates to the university during the application process. And the president is sort of thinking about this as an economist, as the sort of general equilibrium theorist. He's thinking about this problem in terms of rational choice. And so he thinks that there's sort of a choice that's being made by an individual student or a family that has beliefs about conditional futures and preferences, and then decides on the basis of what's going to optimize, on the basis of this sort of fully rational calculation about those beliefs and desires. And Abbott is dismissive of this and says that this idea of how students are choosing between colleges is really manifestly silly. He says that the deciders have no information, or really no real information. They only have lots and lots of noise, which is they're looking at these sort of school catalogs, but all of them are highly motivated to make the schools look good and say give similar sorts of descriptions. The families have some of these beliefs, but for the most part, they're just hearsay and rumor, and they're giving a picture of the schools that's just from decades before the actual student is making the application decision right now. And people look at things like the rating agencies, like US News and World Report, but those really fail to distinguish much between schools that fall within the same general band. So while it may help you get an idea of, what are the top 20 schools? What are the top 50 schools? What are the top 100 schools? Putting any stock on whether US News puts you at 7 or puts you at 9 is really not going to be very helpful to different readers in terms of assessing the prestige of the university. So he says that if you're trying to influence applicants, trying to put your thumb on the scale of the sort of rational calculation that they might make if they had better information than they do have, is a waste of your resources. And that really you should recognize that endowments and contrasts are what are really playing a key role in the decisions that people are making. So people are having affective reactions that are really important. The example he gives is that someone might be more inclined to go to one university versus another because when they visit, they find a parking spot at one, and at the other, they have a particularly bad food day. They didn't like what was being served. And so he said, or they have good or bad memories or sort of colloquial associations with the names of those schools. And so the whole idea is that basically, rather than being this sort of rational, deliberative process of deciding where people are going, instead it's this sort of highly affective process where the student has this sort of emotional repertoire that they're applying to the decision. And the student is basically imagining themselves as a student and thinking about the affective associations they would have if they sort of manufactured their own personal identity as an attender of one school versus as an attender of some other school. And he gives the personal example of his decision to attend Harvard. And he says, I mean, it sounds like he went to some like extremely privileged boarding school where they were sending 20% of the graduating class to Harvard every year. But basically his idea was that there were all these social influences that were constantly around him where it turns out it would have made more sense for him not to go to Harvard, or at the very least it might have. And he wasn't really even considering that. All he was considering was this sort of social pressure to fit in and fit the mold of one of the elites at his university, which is the sort of person that would apply to Harvard and wouldn't even try to go anywhere else. And he gives this sort of analogy with like Calvinism and Calvinist theology, which is basically people are trying to persuade themselves that they're among the elect, that, even if it doesn't even have a causal influence on their future life outcomes, they just like the idea of being this sort of person because they have these sort of positive associations with that group of people, and they think that, I guess God smiles upon that group of people. But, and so in any event, he sort of is giving this example by way of illustration of this sort of relational versus mechanistic thinking, which is that he thinks that the sort of modular mechanistic special science approach that's advocated by people like Elster and Hedstrom is reflective of this sort of silly and reductive idea that the way to approach analyzing the situation is in terms of the rational choice of biological individuals who are making calculations about how to maximize future utility. And he says, really, the best way to think about it is instead as these basically networks of social interactions that are constantly self-reinforcing and influencing students' decisions about who they want to become and really influencing the students' identities heading into these social processes, independent of the actual benefits or costs of the decision. And so, he concludes with this idea that mechanisms want simplified formal accounts that are on the basis of individuals' and rational choice, and that relations is processual, and it says that all relations are endogenous to one another, and that it's sort of for the reason of all these considerations that I've just presented that he tends to favor the latter over the former.
Great. So you drew the important distinction, or referred to his important distinction. Should we focus on the actor or on the action? And maybe you could amplify that a little bit, or just say what you think he means by that.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I was saying, he's talking about what we should take as primitive. So whether we should take it as primitive that there are these sort of social actors, or whether we should take it as primitive that there are social processes.
Mhm.
And he says that one allows you to give an account of social processes in terms of social actors. That's the mechanism view. And the other allows you to give an account of social actors in terms of social processes. And he ultimately ends up arguing, by way of this example, that he just thinks it's going to be impossible to give an adequate account of social actors if you're thinking about them as biological individuals rather than as socially constituted individuals.
So what's really interesting to me about the article and some of the very astute things that you've said about it is it seems like two different things are being confused. Relational versus essentialist is one distinction. So the essentialist would be the actor has an essential nature, an essential set of motivational properties and beliefs and so forth. And that's what we need to know. It's not exactly that it's biological, but it's specific to that individual and it doesn't change. That's essentialist. And relational is that the individual human being, his or her self is fluid over time. That's the relational part. It is influenced by this stream of events and interactions and relationships which he or she has with the external world. On page 12, there's a highlighted passage that I thought was very important. I am arguing the stronger point that the acting self is continuously remade in interaction, and that the environment of possible endowments and contrasts, the environment of others and past experience, provides the ground whence comes this remaking. So there's the idea that, I think you made the point, he kind of exaggerates for effect. To say that it's constantly and continuously being remade sounds a little psychotic, doesn't it? There's no continuity at all for the individual as a human being, a person over time. But I think we can loosen that up a little bit and say the individual's mentality shifts over time, is influenced over time in a very fluid way. So we shouldn't think that it's all inside the head. It's, the influences, the interactions, the conversations, the conflicts, these many ways in which the individual interacts with the college admissions process or the college counselors or the dating scene in high school. All of those different social influences change the individual. That's one point he's making, relational versus essential. But then that doesn't actually have anything to do with mechanisms. And it doesn't have anything to do really with reductionism. It has to do with where should we think about agency? Should we think about it as being in the head, the essential human being who has, in the most extreme case, a utility function and an ability to maximize utility? Or should we think of it richer, as Gross was arguing in the other article, that it's not just about, means and rationality, but it's also about cultural meanings and habitudes and habits. And but it's still associated with the individual. His picture is that even Gross has got it a little bit too firmly established. It's too focused on the kind of fixed and constant properties of the individual. And he would like to see something that's actually more similar to the French sociologist, 1930s, actually he's Belgian, I think. Yeah, we read the little bit of figurative, do you remember the piece about figurative or figurational? Yeah, that's the person I'm thinking of. Because he's also saying it's not the individual, it's the small group of kind of interacting, relationally engaged individuals that are often the active part of sociological change. Anyway, I guess part of what I'm adding to Ethan's presentation, it's not criticizing the presentation, is that there are two different distinctions in play here. One is, do mechanisms help us at all, or do we need a different approach, something about relationality in one sense? And then there's this other point about the theory of the actor. Is it actors as individual units, or is it actions and individuals in relation and kind of this fluid way of changing over time? Does that pair of distinctions make sense to you?
It does, and I think, I mean, an objection I had to the paper was that it felt like it was misleading to frame it in terms of, to frame the contrast that he was studying as between mechanisms and relations, which is, it felt like he had almost nothing to say that was actually an objection to mechanisms. Mainly, he had objections to things that people who like mechanisms also like that are not intimately related to mechanisms, which is to say, the sort of intermediate level of description is not problematized by anything that he says. Methodological individualism is not entailed by mechanisms, and nor do his remarks really even refute methodological individualism. They sort of are just like, here's a layer of nuance that we can add on top of the picture that they're giving, and that shows that their account that they prefer is too reductive. But that I just think in no way undermines mechanisms or methodological individualism or even reductionism, but just is sort of like, oh, here's some extra whipped cream to add on top of a story that you might give those.
It's almost like you started by saying he has a lot of negative things to say about Hedstrom. Hedstrom is one of the chief inventors of analytical sociology. And it's actually analytical sociology he really dislikes. Reductive, trying to simplify down to kind of an atomistic view of how social outcomes are generated. You were going to make a point, weren't you, Austin?
Yeah, I was sort of struggling with this because, you know, there was an element to the earlier sections of this paper that I found really seductive or, you know, interesting in terms of like the way in which focusing on action sort of seems to be an easier way to get towards this more multifaceted conception of the actor when you start with the action. That being said, I don't think that like when you move over to the actual examples that he gives about like school admission, like choices, school choice, it doesn't seem to really follow that like his explanation is one that you can only get through this relational point of view, in which like he talks about the sort of the method of being raised in this sort of like background and that leading towards Harvard, but like you could very easily sort of make a bit more of an actor-centered version of that narrative, which still has many of the same specific concerns. Socially, you know, constituted and situated actor, that is to say, he's like, I don't know, it sounds to me like he grew up as sort of one of the children of the old New England WASP aristocracy, and they are all convinced that like, oh yeah, all of the boring WASPs go to Harvard in order to become rulers, and you're going to do the same. Like you don't need to focus, maybe you should, but it doesn't seem like you have to focus on the action as the sort of central point to understand why Abbott ended up going to Harvard.
And partly for the reason that you mentioned, but you also mentioned in your presentation, and that is that once we think to incorporate a lot of nuance about culture and meaning and the other components of deliberate action, purposive action, then we wind up with a very different picture, because then it's no longer a maximizing, utility-oriented, economistic view of action, but it's nuanced in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. And as you were mentioning, the factors that he refers to that students are responding to, I was remembering taking my daughter, who's now almost 40, but when she was a high school kid, I took her to Vassar College on a college trip, and she had gone to high school in Newton, Massachusetts, which is it was public high school, but a really good high school and just outside of Boston. And as soon as she got out of the car and walked on campus, she looked around and she said, "Dad, I don't know why you brought me here. Can't you tell these girls are nothing like me? This is not a place for me." It was such an interesting thing because it was an instant perception of culture that, what was simpatico to her, what was not simpatico to her. And it was just kind of interesting because it really resonated with what Abbott says. You had a bad meal and you don't feel like going to Princeton. Interesting. Any other comments about either the Abbott piece? You're reading a whole bunch of Abbott now, and that book is a hugely important piece of sociology. It's a really, really valuable piece of sociology in the professions book. I need to make a point of having a little bit of time next time to talk about the book because it's really valuable. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, one other thought I had was that it makes sense that he's sort of this critic of analytic sociology because, I mean, the style of presentation of the arguments is not analytic. And it's sort of like, it's not like very tight arguments or much attention to, deductive validity or making sure that he's proving exactly the thesis that he promised he would prove. But instead, it's almost like there's sort of a stylistic parallel between what he's writing and what he's arguing, which is he's sort of, it seems, going more off of affect and more off of almost like cultivating like a sort of reaction among the reader to the opposing view. And whereas the opponents, the sort of proponents of the mechanistic rational choice, are going to be the ones that are going to be concerned with, well, let's present some premises, let's make sure that they actually jointly entail the conclusion, let's make sure that we're faithful to a thesis that we argue for coherently throughout.
So I'm afraid that there's a lot of self-promotion by the analytical sociologists on that score. What they want to say is other sociologists are not very logical, but we stand up for deductive logic. Hedstrom, whom I like very much, I went to his institute a number of years ago in Sweden and found it really interesting, though both he and Elster were so intolerant of Manzo. We're going to read Manzo when we do agent-based modeling. And Gianluca Manzo, who's now a good friend of mine, was presenting an agent-based model that they didn't agree with. They would not let him finish. They just kept disagreeing on his second slide. It was really kind of embarrassing, frankly. But Hedstrom seemed like a very nice guy. Elster did not seem like a very nice guy. But so what I'm partly saying to Ethan is that analytical sociologists want to present themselves as being the logical ones, but I think that there's some fiction in that. I look at Abbott as being a very rigorous sociologist, also a very creative sociologist. Here's a little passage from, he has a very recent book called Processual Sociology. And here's how he describes processual sociology. By a processual approach, that's not a word you use in everyday conversation, process-like processual approach, I mean an approach that presumes that everything in the social world is continuously in the process of making, remaking, and unmaking itself and other things instant by instant. That is so parallel to what he has to say about the person, the person in relationships, the relationality of the person. So the social world is continuously in the process of making, remaking, and unmaking itself. The social world, this would have fit right into Ethan's presentation. The social world does not consist of atomic units whose interactions obey various rules, as in the thought of the economists, nor does it consist of grand social entities that shape and determine the little lives of individuals, as in the sociology of Durkheim and his followers. So he has a different vision of what sociological analysis ought to be. And this, I think we can relate directly to his treatment of the professions. He wrote that a long time earlier. I had dinner with him at, is it the fish place on Main Street? What's it called? The real fish, real something? There's a fish restaurant on Main Street. The Real Restaurant, maybe it's called. Or Fish, the Real Place. Anyway, it's on the corner of Main and something else. How's that for directions?
Very
Just
helpful.
plug that into maps and see what you get. But anyway, he was there, and I'm forgetting one or two other people. Maybe Mayor Zold was there. But Abbott said the most interesting thing to me. He's kind of acerbic and difficult. And years before I had asked him if he would want to participate in a series of interviews I've done with people I regard as really creative sociologists. And he very acerbically refused to do that. Said no, he wouldn't be willing to do that. But when we had dinner, he was reasonably polite. He gave a seminar right across the hall here. And then several of us went out for dinner with him. But he spoke very poignantly about the fact, I said, your book about professions is really a masterpiece. It's a wonderful piece of work. I really admire it. He said, I have a manuscript in my office. It's this thick. When I die, I've left instructions for my secretary that it needs to be published. It's his life work that has never seen the light of day. But until that appears, I think his book about the professions, and also a book called The Chicago School of Sociology, just absolutely brilliant pieces of work. So in other words, I don't quite agree with the idea that he's not rigorous, he's not logical and rational, but he's got a different view of what good sociology ought to look like. And on top of that, exactly as you said in the first sentence of your presentation, he's not interested in being especially polite. Though, frankly, I think he was poorly treated in the composition of that volume. That volume became the standard volume on social mechanisms. I didn't ask him to buy it, but it has pieces by Elster and some of the, I think Coleman may have an essay in it. It's really kind of definitive. He should have been in there. And it is kind of insulting. I think you mentioned that his essay was not included. But his response was also a pretty obnoxious response. So go figure. Good work. Thank you. Nice presentation. And next time we're changing the subject, believe it or not. I think we're talking about sociology of knowledge, which brings us to Rorty, once again, Gross on Rorty. I pulled out of, to make it affordable to you, I have free access to little segments of his book about Rorty. I hope I'm not misremembering what's coming next. I think it's.
I have to perform on that, present on that one. So,
And that's next week.
yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm not wrong then. Really interesting topic, but kind of different from what we've been doing. But I thought in this course, it would be valuable to see some different, interesting, intriguing topics now that we're really rolling on actors, theory of the actor, action-centered sociology, and now processual sociology. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks. You may want to pick up the Kindle in that case. You may want to pick up the Kindle or read the whole book. I'm not asking you to, but
It's
really
actually very
interesting book.
funny because the other presentation I'm doing is in 2 weeks on Devil's Handwriting.
Uh-huh.
And that book, because George is one of my prelim advisors, I
Mhm.
threw the book onto the prelim list I'm doing with him.